Edward did not just cancel Marissa's wedding. He walked into a room filled with flowers, relatives, rings, and vows that had already been written for him, looked at the woman wearing a white dress, and said the one thing nobody expected to hear. "I'm not marrying you today. I don't even know if I can trust you after this." In one sentence, Marissa's romantic surprise became a public disaster. But the real controversy is not simply that Edward said no. The bigger question is why Marissa believed surrounding him with an officiant, emotional relatives, and a fully prepared ceremony would make him ready for a marriage he had already said he was not prepared to enter. Was this a desperate act from a woman terrified of losing the man she loved? Or was it pressure disguised as romance? Because Marissa did not only hide a dress and some decorations. She moved money from a shared account, involved Edward's friend, allowed her family to believe the wedding was confirmed, and continued with the plan after Edward directly told her he needed more time. And Edward did not discover the truth because Marissa finally decided to be honest. He found one suspicious payment. That single clue made every hidden notification, every strange phone call, and every nervous excuse suddenly make sense. But even after realizing what she might be planning, Edward stayed quiet. He gave Marissa one last chance to tell him the truth. What she did with that chance is the real reason this relationship may never recover. 48 hours before everything collapsed, Edward believed he was preparing for a formal engagement dinner. That was the story Marissa gave him. She said her family wanted to celebrate their relationship, bring everyone together, and create one peaceful evening after weeks of tension. On the surface, that sounded believable. Edward and Marissa had been arguing more often. His possible trip home had become a major source of fear. Her family was questioning his commitment. A supportive dinner might have helped everyone calm down. But Marissa was not planning a dinner. She had already reserved a small wedding venue. She paid the deposit, arranged an officiant, bought simple rings, invited relatives, prepared vows, and asked Edward's friend to make sure he arrived without discovering the truth. She planned almost everything. The flowers were ready. The guests were ready. The wedding dress was ready. The only thing she had not confirmed was whether the groom actually wanted to get married that day. That is where this stops feeling like a sweet surprise. You can surprise someone with flowers. You can surprise them with a vacation. You can even surprise someone with a proposal when marriage has already been openly discussed. But you cannot treat an actual wedding like a surprise party. A wedding requires two informed people making the same decision freely. Marissa was not just hoping Edward would feel emotional when he saw her. She was counting on the pressure inside that room. She believed that once he saw her in the dress, once he noticed the rings, and once he realized her entire family was watching, saying no would become almost impossible. That reveals something important about Marissa's mindset. She was no longer asking, "Is Edward ready to marry me?" She was asking, "How can I create a moment where Edward will feel too guilty to refuse?" Those are not the same thing. Marissa convinced herself that Edward's hesitation was not a real answer. In her mind, he was only scared. He did not truly need more time. He just needed a dramatic push toward the future they had already discussed. That belief allowed her to ignore everything Edward had been trying to tell her. Edward had recently mentioned returning home temporarily. He had family responsibilities, financial concerns, and personal issues he wanted to handle. More importantly, he admitted that their relationship did not feel stable enough for an immediate marriage. Their arguments were getting more intense. Small disagreements were turning into emotional confrontations. Marissa's family was becoming involved in decisions that should have remained between the couple. Edward felt like every request for space was being treated as a threat. His position was not that he would never marry Marissa. His position was that marriage should not be used to cover problems they had not solved. But Marissa did not hear caution. She heard abandonment. When Edward said, "I need more time," Marissa heard, "I am looking for a way to leave." When he talked about going home, she heard, "I may never come back." When he asked for emotional space, she believed he was already separating himself from her. And this is what makes Marissa more complicated than a simple villain. Her behavior was manipulative, but the motivation appears to come from panic. She was so afraid of losing Edward that she started making decisions designed to reduce his freedom to leave. That does not make the plan acceptable. But it does explain why she was able to convince herself that it was romantic. Fear can completely distort the way someone understands a relationship. A delay starts feeling like rejection. A request for space feels like punishment. A reasonable boundary becomes evidence that the other person is preparing an escape. Marissa did not believe she was trapping Edward. She believed she was saving the relationship before he could walk away from it. And instead of helping Marissa slow down, her mother increased the pressure. Rather than encouraging an honest conversation, Marissa's mother supported the secret ceremony. Her argument was simple: Edward might never commit unless Marissa created the moment herself. She believed that once Edward stood in front of the officiant and saw the effort the family had made, his love would become stronger than his hesitation. But that advice treated Edward's boundary like an obstacle that needed to be defeated. It assumed his hesitation was meaningless. It also turned the wedding into a loyalty test. If Edward agreed, he loved Marissa. If he refused, he had never been serious. And if Marissa warned him, he might avoid the ceremony. That kind of thinking leaves no space for a mature answer. Edward could not say, "I love you, but I am not ready today." In Marissa's mind, anything except an immediate yes would prove that he was planning to abandon her. That is exactly where the audience would likely split. Some fans would feel deeply sorry for Marissa. Her fear was clearly genuine. She believed Edward's trip home could become permanent. She had invested emotionally in a future with him, and every delay made that future feel less real. A section of viewers might say Edward created part of this insecurity by talking about leaving without giving Marissa enough reassurance. They may argue that Marissa did not wake up one morning and randomly decide to plan a secret wedding. She reacted to weeks of uncertainty, mixed signals, and a relationship that no longer felt secure. But many viewers would also say fear does not give someone the right to control another person's decision. Marriage cannot be used as relationship insurance. A ceremony does not guarantee that someone will stay. And pressuring a hesitant partner usually creates more distance, not more commitment. The most dangerous part of Marissa's plan was that it was designed to silence the answer she feared. She did not want Edward to choose. She wanted the room to choose for him. The plan might have remained hidden until the last moment if Edward had not checked their shared expenses. He noticed a large payment to a business he did not recognize. The amount seemed far too high for a simple family dinner. When he asked Marissa about it, she claimed her mother had upgraded the event. More guests, more food, more decorations. That explanation might have worked if Marissa had stayed calm. Instead, she became defensive. She refused to show him a receipt. She accused him of ruining the surprise. She acted as though a completely reasonable question about shared money proved he did not trust her. That reaction made Edward more suspicious than the payment itself. When somebody has an honest explanation, they usually do not need to attack you for asking. So Edward quietly searched the business name. It was not a restaurant. It was a wedding venue. And suddenly, all the small details changed meaning. Marissa had been hiding phone notifications whenever he walked into the room. Her mother had been making repeated calls and ending them the moment Edward appeared. A garment bag had been moved into another room. Marissa had casually asked about his ring size. She had become strangely determined that he wear one specific suit to the dinner. Edward was no longer preparing for a family gathering. He was investigating his own relationship. But then, he made a controversial decision. He stayed silent. Some viewers would immediately question that choice. If Edward suspected a wedding, why did he not confront Marissa right then? Why allow the plan to continue? Why risk humiliating her in front of the family? That criticism is fair. Edward had enough information to stop the ceremony before it reached the venue. But his silence also appears to have been a test. He wanted to see whether Marissa would tell him the truth without being forced. He was not testing whether she loved him. He was testing whether she could choose honesty when honesty might destroy the outcome she wanted. The night before the event, Edward gave her that chance. He asked Marissa directly whether she was hiding anything important from him. Marissa paused. That pause mattered. She understood the question. She knew Edward was not asking about food, decorations, or some harmless family surprise. She could feel that he was offering her an opening. She could have admitted everything. She could have said the plan had gone too far. She could have canceled the ceremony and accepted the embarrassment privately. Instead, she denied it. Edward then made his position even clearer. He told Marissa he was not ready to get married immediately. He still cared about her. He was not automatically ending the relationship, but he believed they needed to rebuild trust before making a legal commitment. He wanted their major decisions to remain between them instead of being controlled by relatives. He wanted them to prove they could handle conflict without threats, panic, or emotional pressure. Marissa heard every word. Then she accused him of searching for excuses. She told him the family dinner would remind him how much support their relationship had. That was the point where the secret wedding became more than a bad idea. It became a direct betrayal. Marissa was no longer guessing how Edward felt. He had clearly told her. He said he was not ready, explained why, and asked for time. She understood his answer and moved forward anyway. That changes how the audience sees Edward. At first, he could easily look like the cold partner avoiding commitment. Reality TV viewers have seen that pattern many times. One person gives up stability, moves for love, and waits for a promise while the other keeps delaying. So when Marissa accuses Edward of making excuses, some fans may immediately believe her. But once Edward asks for honesty and consent while Marissa continues planning behind his back, the dynamic flips. Edward is not asking for an escape. He is asking for a voice. Marissa is the one refusing to respect it. And just when Edward thought he understood the size of the deception, an accidental message exposed something even worse. A relative sent him a message that was apparently intended for Marissa. It included instructions about when Edward should enter the room, where the officiant would stand, and how everyone should react when Marissa revealed the wedding dress. But one sentence changed the entire situation. The relative suggested Edward would not be able to say no once the family surrounded him. That sentence exposed the strategy. The pressure was not an accidental side effect. The pressure was part of the plan. Everyone involved understood that Edward would be placed in an emotionally impossible position. He could either marry Marissa or reject her in front of relatives who had already spent money, dressed for the ceremony, and arrived expecting a celebration. That is not a free decision. That is a public trap. Edward then contacted the friend who had been asked to bring him to the venue. The friend finally admitted Marissa had involved him. He defended her by saying she only wanted to create a beautiful memory. Edward's answer cut through every excuse. A beautiful memory cannot begin with deception. And that is why this wedding was already broken before Edward entered the room. Even if he had agreed, what would the marriage have been built on? He would eventually learn that Marissa had hidden shared expenses. He would know her family participated in the lie. He would realize his friend helped deliver him to a ceremony without warning him. He would also know that somebody else had written the vows he was expected to speak. The ceremony might have happened, but the resentment would have entered the marriage with them. Edward then learned Marissa had already told several relatives that they were getting married. The guests were not arriving for a possible wedding. They believed the decision had already been made. Now Edward had a choice of his own. He could confront Marissa privately and allow her to cancel everything quietly. Or he could go to the venue and make every person involved face what they had helped create. He chose to go. This is where Edward's behavior becomes debatable. Some fans would say he wanted to punish Marissa. He knew what was waiting. He knew she would be wearing a dress. He understood how humiliating a public refusal would be. He could have stopped it earlier. That is a valid criticism. But another section of the audience would argue that a private confrontation would have allowed everyone to minimize the deception. Marissa's mother could have blamed Edward for misunderstanding. His friend could have denied knowing the full plan. The family could have continued treating the secret ceremony like a harmless act of love. By showing up, Edward forced the truth into the open. When he arrived, there was no longer any possibility that this was just an elaborate dinner. The room was filled with flowers. Chairs were arranged for a ceremony. The rings were displayed. The officiant was waiting. Photographs had been prepared. Even Edward's vows were ready. Think about that. Someone had written the words Edward was supposed to say while making one of the biggest promises of his life. That detail tells you how little his actual voice mattered. Then Marissa appeared in a white dress. She looked nervous, but hopeful. She told Edward the ceremony was proof of how much she loved him. For a few seconds, everyone seemed to expect the perfect reaction. Edward would become emotional. Marissa would cry. The family would celebrate. And the deception would be forgiven because the room looked romantic. Instead, Edward asked one question. Did you plan this before or after I told you I wasn't ready? Marissa could not answer. And there was no answer that could save her. If she planned it before their conversation, she still continued after hearing his concerns. If she planned it afterward, she deliberately ignored everything he said. Marissa's mother immediately stepped in. She accused Edward of embarrassing her daughter and reminded him that the family had sacrificed time and money for the ceremony. But Edward made the point nobody in that room wanted to hear. He never asked them to make those sacrifices. People cannot create an obligation for someone and then call that person selfish for refusing it. If you spend money on a decision another person never approved, the decision does not suddenly become theirs. Many viewers would likely support Edward in that moment. The family's disappointment was real. But Marissa created those expectations. Edward never promised those guests a wedding. Still, some fans may believe Edward looked too calm. Marissa was devastated. Her mother was furious. The guests were shocked. Edward appeared almost emotionally detached. But calm does not always mean cold. Sometimes a person becomes unusually controlled because the emotional reaction already happened in private. Edward had found the venue, read the message, confronted his friend, and given Marissa a final chance to confess. By the time he entered the room, he was not discovering the betrayal. He was delivering his response. Marissa finally admitted why she kept the plan secret. She believed Edward would leave if she waited. Every delay made her feel less secure. His possible trip home convinced her that he was slowly building an exit. She claimed she did not want to control him. She wanted to remind him of the future they once discussed. In Marissa's imagination, Edward would see the dress, the rings, and the people who loved them, and suddenly remember that they belonged together. That confession makes the situation sadder. It does not make it healthier. Marissa confused commitment with certainty. She believed marriage would remove her fear. But marriage does not automatically heal insecurity. If she already saw every request for space as abandonment, a wedding certificate would not erase that pattern. It might make it worse. Every disagreement could become another threat. Every trip home could become evidence that Edward was leaving. Every boundary could feel like rejection. Edward understood that Marissa's fear would follow them into the marriage. He told her she had not created a loving moment. She had created a situation where saying no would make him look heartless. Then Marissa asked the most emotionally loaded question she could ask. Do you love me? That question reduced the entire conflict to one painful idea. If Edward loved her, why would he refuse to marry her? But Edward's answer revealed the deeper problem. Love was not the only issue. He could love Marissa and still refuse to marry her under pressure. And that is probably the most important point in this entire story. Love does not erase dishonesty. Love does not remove the need for consent. Love does not mean one person must surrender every boundary to prove loyalty. And love should never require someone to make a permanent decision because a room full of people is watching. Then Edward made the decision that destroyed the ceremony. He removed the ring Marissa had previously given him and placed it beside the unused wedding rings. He said the wedding was over, but he did not immediately declare the relationship permanently finished. Instead, he told Marissa he was moving out and returning home alone. He needed distance before deciding whether the engagement could survive. That was more complicated than a dramatic breakup. Edward still cared about her. He did not call their entire relationship fake. He did not deny that the love had once been real. But he said he would not marry someone who had major decisions from him, and he would not reward emotional pressure by giving in. Marissa's mother called him selfish. Edward replied that forcing a wedding would be far more selfish than stopping one. Marissa begged him to stay until the guests left so they could talk privately. But Edward reminded her that they already had that opportunity. The night before, he asked whether she was hiding something. She chose the plan over the truth. That was the real emotional payoff. Edward was not walking away because Marissa made one